Have you ever wondered what the sands of the Sahara hide from us? Where did so much sand come from, and what could have happened in the first place? Looking at maps from the 17th century, we see large developing cities in Africa. However, when we turn to the official history, we do not get a clear answer, well, or something like that, say, domestic animals ate all the vegetation. Now let's look for ourselves. Looking at Google Maps, we see craters, large craters and sinkholes in many parts of the Sahara. And this is what Africa looked like in 1688, it's densely populated and there are many large cities in the center, and I remind you this is the 17th century. This makes us realize that the population of Africa was recently developed, but for some reason drought came and the blooming continent was in an instant lost to oblivion. This topic is explored in more detail in our full video on the channel. Currently, our past is covered not only with mysteries and riddles that originate long ago, but also a very deep layer of earth and not only soil, which hides from us huge buildings, whole meters of floors and structures of antiquity. In fact, our history goes far back not into the past as we think, but far beneath the layers of earth. The capitals, the buildings, and the monuments of yesteryear. Everything is covered with a layer of soil, and even strangely a huge layer of sand. But where it all came from, and layers, and sand, and most importantly, what hides underneath, let's understand it. Strange as it may seem, our eyes are not able to recreate the whole picture of what we see. Observing and looking at buildings, we see only the tip of that iceberg that goes deep, deep into the bowels of our planet. But was it like this before? In general, where did these tens of meters of cultural layer, which cover whole floors and sometimes buildings, come from? But is it all limited to the ground? After all, we still do not know what these barchans as high as multi-story buildings store behind them. Where did so much sand come from? What could have happened so that practically the whole continent turned into a lifeless desert, and instead of rivers and lakes, i.e. water, there was only oil and petrified organics. Everything plunged under the flame of the sun into absolute empty silence. In this video we will dive under these uncharted sands and understand the real reason of deserts known to us. At the end we will understand what is wrong with these sands, whether they are artificial or not. And at the end we will look at the photos, which do not fit into our official history. It is very strange, where the remains of railroads in Africa come from, and it is even strange why they were not written and talked about before. I've always wondered why, throughout time, something is being dug up and dug up and dug up. All the time they find deep underground, under the soil, under the sand, whole floors of buildings and other structures, and sometimes even whole cities. We are told, all this is a cultural layer, well, at least not a layer of dust, although the comparison is absolutely similar, but only archaeologists dig up the remains of cities and at a depth of more than 2 meters. An interesting fact is that, for example, in the far north, the cultural layer grows very slowly, usually 1 centimeter per 100 years of soil growth. Jagal in the tundra grows 2 months a year, there is almost no decline, and everything is preserved very, very well. But then a logical question arises at once. Where this layer comes from, but maybe from the same place where the sand layer in deserts comes from. Agree the mysteries of deserts do not leave indifferent any of us. In fact, it's just amazing, a huge sandbox almost the size of the mainland. For us, the desert is miles of sand, heat, drought. I don't think I'm the only one who thinks of the Sahara Desert first. It seems to be one of the largest deserts in the world, but no. It is second only to a few, and most interestingly to one of the most massive and mysterious deserts, Antarctica. Strangely enough, yes, Antarctica is also the largest desert, but today we're only taking apart the sandy ones, and yet we're going to find out where that amount of sand came from. If you think about it, have you ever noticed the simple fact that on the territory of America there are no sand deserts, well, except for one very small one, while on our continent everything is covered with sand and in a very chaotic order. We have deserts scattered all over the map, and it is not limited to one continent. What is not a desert? It is a graveyard of some ancient civilization. Most of all, of course, there are questions about the appearance of the Great Desert, which is how locals call the Sahara in Arabic, namely the largest and most ruthless desert of the world, Sahara. Incredibly cruel climate and temperature regime, which simply does not give the development of life in this desert, and strangely enough, the climate here is very prone to huge variations. During the day the thermometer mark can rise above 30, 35 degrees 30, and at night drops to 0 and even sometimes to -5, 10 degrees. For centuries, the sands of the Sahara have swallowed up people, animals and even entire cities. Even now, the desert is always expanding to swallow up new territories as if nothing had happened. But where does it come from? How a desert the size of the mainland came to be? Let's take a look at a map. It's not all confined to one continent. And yes, by the way, the size of the continent is not so unambiguous as it seems to us, because Africa itself is much larger than Russia, and let it be a surprise to you, Africa is twice as large as Russia. We are more accustomed to the fact that the maps look like this. After all, we blindly believe what we are taught from school. If scientific minds say Africa is like this, then we can't even question it. But look at the real comparison of Africa and Russia, maybe it will open someone's eyes to what is going on. Well, in principle, no one is hiding it. Anyone who wants can take the size of Russia 17 million square kilometers and compare it with 30 million square kilometers of Africa. But usually we just believe what we see with our own eyes on maps, as well as what we are told, without even delving into it all. But still, where is there so much sand? I think it did not fall from the sky. In general, deserts in general amaze us with their structure and forms. Just look, what a clear division of contrasts. Look, but the Atacama Desert in Chile also somehow does not fit into the story that we are offered, because this desert is by right the driest in the world. According to NASA reports, the Atacama Desert in Chile is the driest desert in the world. It is 50 times drier than the Death Valley in the state of California in the United States. The desert covers more than 105 square kilometers and is mostly made up of salt pools, lava flows, and lots of sand. The average rainfall in this region is only 1 millimeter per year. But what was the world's surprise when, contrary to all the words and beliefs of historians, this desert blossomed? An amazing desert that breaks all the stereotypes of modern scientists. But look at this desert. No, it's not Antarctica, and no, it's not a layer of snow. It's sand, snow-white sand, where the usual quartz has been replaced by gypsum, which has changed the picture dramatically. I think many people associate desert only with high sand dunes of bizarre shapes, barch and cacti, tumbleweeds, and of course with almost complete absence of vegetation and animal life. But at the same time sands occupy only about 15% of the territory of the Sahara Desert, and the main landscape is only rocky plateaus. But how it all formed, how these sandy plateaus came to be. Let's see what the textbooks tell us about it, and they tell us that it was all eaten by goats with cows, sheep and camels. It's a bit of a nonsense. It's very interesting that livestock ate all the vegetation that just didn't have time to renew itself. You realize how many livestock can eat all the vegetation on the mainland. I think, in any eventuality, it's basically unrealistic. It's more likely that the topsoil was just stripped away, with the soil and the roots of the plants and everything growing. Doesn't that remind you of anything? To put it in other words, the skin was removed to kill the surface, so that even the seeds were not able to germinate. Let's imagine, if there were cattle, it means that there must have been a civilization, and not just any civilization, but a huge civilization. But did it leave any traces behind? Strangely enough, but still left, some of which we still gradually find, and some for centuries remain in the thickness of sand, which is very unfortunate. If to make excavations, under all this thickness of sand, we will find clays, remains of soils, consequently there were fertile lands, but in some moment, namely within a very short period of time they were covered with sand. You just have to look at the ground level and the desert next to it. And this is the Gobi Desert. It looks as if a huge pile of sand has just been dumped on the ground. You just imagine what can be under this pile of sand, not just buried houses, buildings, and perhaps the whole city. Well, if they're still there, we just haven't heard a word about them. It's an incredible coincidence, but in the place of modern deserts there used to be centers of former world civilizations. Well, you can at least see that on ancient maps, of which there are many. Long ago life was boiling here, castles and fortresses stood, fields were waiting for harvest, and livestock grazed in the meadows. Perhaps wild animals roamed here, and various fish swam in rivers and lakes. Let us look at one of the maps of Africa's past, namely the year 1688. We observe the abundance of towns and rivers. The coasts are very densely populated, but at the same time there are many large cities in the center of the desert. And yes, this is the 17th century. For comparison, let's just look at our modern map of Africa. We see one lifeless piece of rock that has dried up to the ground. Where are the many cities that have vanished without a trace, or they have simply gone under layers of sand? And here's another map. Maybe the cartographers just made a mistake and drew cities by accident. Well, here's a map from the 16th century. On it there are no deserts at all, and in place of modern deserts quite a good climate and high density of signs of civilization, with cities megapolises. But the main thing is that the continent is green, and in the center there is a forest. But on this picture, for some reason, some Europeans are depicted, some kings, towers, fortresses and castles. It's strange how it all turned out to be in Africa in the 17th century. Or is there something we don't know? Well, if to reason logically, that cartographers drew some city, then, theoretically, it should have existed in reality. Or at least remnants of cities. Yes, and as is not surprising, in fact, excavations take place, and they are very successful, but about them in most cases just keep silent in favor of tense political events between countries. Digging, searching, and finding, on the edge of the famous Sahara Desert. Not long ago, they found a city that had been hidden by the sands for over 1,000 years. This is Timgod, an extremely rare example of a perfectly preserved public library. It housed manuscripts on religion, military history and government. The surviving shelves of this institution can be seen among the ruins of the city to this day. And in the center of the Sahara Desert there is a very interesting natural monument. It reminds us of the remains of the foundation of a whole city. And it makes us realize that the population of Africa recently may have been very developed, that is, allowed to build very technologically advanced at that time cities, structures and buildings. And then most likely came the drought, and the sand in one moment absorbed with itself the whole settlement, and even the whole blooming continent with its gardens, forests and people, which in one moment of history disappeared into oblivion. According to map analysis this all happened not so recently, but now this is one of the largest and most ruthless deserts in the world. It is very strange, but the Sahara has recently become inaccessible for any research at all. At the moment, bloody conflicts are burning red flames all along its borders. It's terrible, but where oil is extracted instead of water, the fight for oil is replaced by another war. It's a war for water. It's scary to think, but for the people living there, water is priceless. You won't drink oil, but you need to quench your thirst somehow, and water is life. I think you could not imagine that under the Sahara there is a whole sea, and not just any Akaba, underground rivers or lakes, but the whole sea. Well, if you compare these volumes, it would be enough to supply the entire African continent with water for about 500 years. And yes, Gaddafi knew it very well and decided to use water for his people with benefit, having created the largest project of construction of modern civilization, so to say a man-made river. And he called it the eighth wonder of the world. The total length of the underground artificial river is about 4,000 kilometers. But, here is the most important thing, the Libyan government did not charge the population for water, because this amount of water is enough for everyone. However, we know how it all ended with the loss of Gaddafi, lost his ideas and hope for a bright future. As the video comes to an end, I'd like to show you some very strange roads in the middle of the desert in Mali. These are roads that stretch across the desert for many, many kilometers. But what do you think they are? Maybe railroads. Oh, yes, because somehow you had to travel across such a gigantic continent. Think about it, in fact, it's like crossing two Russias. But here's what's interesting. Apart from these walls and small extinct volcanoes located next to them, there are huge craters in the Sahara Desert. To me they remind perhaps lunar or even Martian landscapes, but no, this is the Sahara Desert, a great desert, reliably hiding numerous secrets of our forgotten past. And now, as it is not unfortunate, only pickup trucks with machine guns drive on these dunes, either guarding or on the contrary, pushing away from this place all inquisitive and uninvited guests. To conceal all this is not an easy task, because here and there new facts pop up, impressing the minds of more and more new people and researchers. Thank you for watching. I will be glad if you support me in this video, share it with friends, because it will allow most people to realize the reality of what is happening. Subscribe to the channel, put a like. Thank you, and see you soon.